Good evening. I'm Rob Phillips, and I'm the archivist responsible for the Welsh Political Archive at the National Library of Wales. This evening's talk focuses on Gareth Vaughan-Jones, a Welsh journalist who, in his brief but influential career, witnessed the rise of fascism, the collapse of the world economy into the Great Depression, and exposed the terrible man-made famine in the Soviet Union. The Welsh Political Archive is a dedicated programme within the National Library to collect, store, catalogue and promote archival material which reflects the political life of Wales. We hold the papers of well-known political figures, members of the Senedd, members of Parliament, Lords, members of the European Parliament, as well as the formal records of the main political parties, business and labour groups, campaign groups, and we define political in quite a broad terms. The Welsh Political Archive also holds the archives of journalists, because in many cases their work, whilst not being party political focused, is inherently political and provides the lens through which politics, government and international relations are viewed. One of the other significant journalistic archives we hold is the archive of Wynford Vaughan-Thomas. Thomas was only a few years younger than Jones and made his name reporting the Second World War, with dispatches from the Anzio landings, a radio item recorded in an RAF plane while on a bombing raid over Germany, and the first report from the liberated camp at Bergen-Belsen. Whilst Thomas reported from the battlefield and charted the fall of the Third Reich, Gareth reported profusely on its creation and the circumstances that allowed that to happen. Now, being an archivist puts you in a privileged position. We don't have time to research the papers we're responsible for. That's not our job. Our job is to make sure they're available for the historians, journalists, and interested members of the public. They can study real primary sources, unfiltered, at least to some extent, by editing. But we do get the chance to see the papers which reflect a life's work, and in organising and cataloguing them, we have a unique insight and responsibility. You often develop a kind of relationship with the creator of an archive, an understanding and respect for what they were trying to do. I've certainly found this with Gareth's archive. I'm not an expert on Gareth, and plenty has been written on him and his work by Margaret Siriel-Colley and Ray Gamache, amongst others, and I will be relying on some of the work they've done during this session. But I can give you my insight into Gareth's legacy in terms of the papers that he left and what they tell us about him, what drove him, and how he saw the world and his role in it. Gareth was born in 1905. The son of Edgar William Jones, who was the headmaster of Barry County School, and Anne Gwenllian Jones, who had worked as a tutor to the grandchildren of the industrialist John Hughes, who founded the town of Hughes-Gover in modern-day Donetsk in Ukraine. Gareth was born on the 12th of August 1905, so the 13th of August 1905. So the choice of today as the date for this talk is quite appropriate. He was academically gifted and studied first at the University College of Wales in Aberystwyth before taking a second degree in French, German and Russian at Trinity College, Cambridge. He was fluent in those three languages, as well as English and Welsh. Gareth's papers, which we hold at the National Library of Wales, begin around this time and contain student notebooks and letters from his family. The archive comprises 20 boxes and contains a fascinating variety of material. There are letters to his family from university and while travelling on assignments, his diaries, notebooks, drafts of reports and articles, copies of published articles, and a large collection of photographs and lantern slides. Due to Gareth's interest in global affairs, and especially his reporting from the Soviet Union, it is an archive of international significance. Ukraine's Deputy Ambassador to the UK visited the National Library in 2017, along with Nigel Linton-Colley, Gareth's great-nephew, who did so much to promote Gareth's legacy and interest. And interest has recently been increased again with the release of the movie Mr. Jones, starring James Norton, who were able to show in the library earlier this year. This evening's talk will concentrate mainly on the parts of the archive that we've recently digitised. Support from the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Foundation, the Ukrainian National Women's League of America, and the Temerity Family Foundation, and of course, with the support of Gareth's family. The material that's so far been digitised, there are a few more files to complete, comprises 20 files of letters from University in Aberystwyth and Cambridge, and from many parts of the world sent while Gareth was either working or travelling. There are 49 diaries and notebooks, ranging from notes made for study in university and appointment diaries, to those containing notes while researching for articles and travelling more widely. His passport, and around 135 photographs, mostly taken while he was in Mongolia and China on his round-the-world trip in 1934 and 1935. The early letters and diaries created whilst he was studying reveal a lot about Gareth. There are copious notes on language, 3 notebooks on French, for example, but also notebooks such as B35 on subjects such as Russia, European affairs, and medieval Welsh history. We also help understand why Gareth decided to become a journalist. In a letter sent in 1939, that's in file 18, which is not yet available online, he explains to his parents why the life of an academic doesn't appeal to him. He said, "I should consider myself a flabby little coward if I ever gave up on the chance of a good and interesting career for the mere thought of safety. I have no thought for a man whose acceptance or judgment of a post depends on the answer to the question, will it give me a pension? I have come to the conclusion that the only life I can live with interest and which can really be of use is one connected with the foreign affairs and with men and women of today, not with the writers of centuries ago." That isn't to say that Gareth wasn't interested in the writers of centuries ago. He craved travel, adventure, and clearly wanted to be witness to the big events that were happening all around him. Another note in file B36, which is visible on the left of the screen, gives another insight into Gareth's interest in journalism. He makes a point about the campaign against Al Smith, Democratic Party candidate for President of the United States, where pictures were circulated by the Republicans of Al Smith at the opening of the Holland Tubes, but with a caption that he was creating a tunnel to the Vatican. This was designed to stir up anti-Catholic sentiment against Smith. Now, as it happened, Herbert Hoover, the Republican candidate, won the election by a landslide, of course only to lose to Franklin Delano Roosevelt in another landslide 4 years later. Gareth also later met Al Smith, and according to the notes in his letters, was thoroughly unimpressed. What is striking about this is the similarity to some of the issues we face in politics today. In some ways, this idea of the photograph there was the form of the meme we see on social media, where a picture and a caption, often unrelated to each other, circulate widely and serve to either spread disinformation or reinforce prejudice. This is, of course, the very basis of fake news. Perhaps this tells us why Gareth wanted to be connected with foreign affairs and the men and women of today. He was interested in the way that words and pictures could be used to convey emotions, to inform and entertain. But he also realised that they could be used to spread disinformation, hatred, and prejudice. Gareth's brief career happened during the collapse of the world economy and the rise of fascism in the early 1930s. His reports from around the world reflect the building tensions, ethnic divisions, rising terror and oppression. It was a world which needed people dedicated to truthful, factual, and complete reporting, and Gareth was determined to play his part in that, even at cost to himself. After graduation from Cambridge, Gareth spent a few months working at the foreign desk on the Times, before he landed a job with former Prime Minister David Lloyd George as his foreign affairs advisor. Lloyd George was still a well-known and respected statesman, and this contact opened up many opportunities to Gareth. He was able to work in a field he loved, world affairs, and for a man for whom he had great respect. In his journalistic career, Lloyd George features many times. In comparison with other world leaders, compared to other world leaders, usually quite favourably. While working for Lloyd George, Gareth wrote reports on a variety of subjects. And while this file sadly has not been digitised, in its file 22, a quick look at the catalogue record will show you the kind of subjects covered, such as disarmament, imperial conferences, India, the League of Nations, Soviet Union, war debts, defence and trade. To be briefing the former Prime Minister on issues such as this must have been quite something, especially for somebody just out of university. And this appointment also gave Gareth a valuable network, which he would later use to gain access to influential figures, and which was key in his visit to Ukraine in 1933. At this time, he was able to make his first visit to Ukraine, to Hugh Scover. One letter in file 11 from this trip has been digitised. And this letter was sent from Kharkov station, where Gareth described the food. He says, "Yesterday afternoon in Tula station, I had a real treat, a cheese sandwich, cakes and lemonade." He also tells of how good the trip was and of a long discussion with the communists about factories and engineers. From the letters sent in the Soviet Union, it appeared that Gareth was having a great time and that he saw a land of proud workers and progress. He even sent a postcard of Stalin from Moscow, as visible on the left, on the 15th of August 1930, where he tells of plans to visit state and collective farms before he travels on to Berlin. However, his letter, which he sent from Berlin on the 26th of August, it's visible on the right, tells a very different story. He says, "Hooray! It is wonderful to be in Germany again. Absolutely wonderful. Russia is in a very bad state. Rotten. No food. Only bread. Oppression, injustice, and misery among the workers, and 90% discontented. I saw some very bad things." Of course, in this context, he's using the term Russia, but he's referring to the Soviet Union as a sort of catch-all. Now, Gareth's interest in the Ukraine dated back to his childhood due to his mother's time in Hugh Scover, and throughout his career, he maintained a strong interest in Ukrainian affairs. This stood him in good stead when he reported on the horrors of the famine in 1933. As he wrote at the time, his report wasn't just based on his brief visit to part of the country and conversations with a limited number of people in one area. He knew the country better than most outsiders. He had spent time researching, so he knew what he was talking about. Although it does seem that the conditions were a bit of a shock to him on his first visit. He was wise enough, however, not to put that in his letters from the Soviet Union, and he would be better prepared on his second and third visits. On his return from the Soviet Union, Gareth published a number of articles, but many did not carry his name or in non-mainstream publications. This, according to Reagash, meant that he managed to stay somewhat under the radar. Had he made more of a splash in 1930, Soviet authorities may never have allowed him to return. While working for Lloyd George, Gareth made a trip to Central Europe, where he was able to witness firsthand the effects of the Great Depression and of the Treaty of Versailles, which had redrawn the boundaries of much of the region. He visited Germany, and as well as meeting with government officials, he talked at length with ordinary people that he met, and who told him of the desperate situation and of the flow of citizens to the political extremes, the fascists and the communists. In Upper Silesia, Gareth recorded feelings of the ethnic German population who felt oppressed, lived in fear of violence. His notes can be seen on the image on the left of the screen. And the waiter explaining it's bad for Germans. A German can't get on. During the elections, there was terror. It's bad for parents to send their children to German schools. And at the bottom of the same page, a barber, Gareth speaks, makes a similar point. A German can't get on. He can be beaten. All these people from Galicia and Warsaw get the best posts. People here are very discontented. Why shouldn't Upper Silesians get these jobs? On the next page in that diary, another person notes that it's dangerous to speak German in public. And whilst we see on the left there that 70% of workers belong to German trade unions, there were fears that these protections they enjoyed would end in 1937. Brewing tensions, exacerbated by the dire economic situation, was clear to Gareth. And of course, these tensions were to provide Hitler with some of the justification he used for his early territorial claims. While Gareth's interests in international affairs were varied, oppression and what we would now call intercommunity tensions feature prominently in his writing. Now, at this point, Hitler's appointment as Chancellor was still 2 years away, but the pressure on democratic systems had already led to rigged elections. Gareth's visit to Poland came close on the heels of the Brest election of November 1930, elections which were rigged in favour of the governing parties, which led to opposition leaders being arrested and imprisoned. Clark, that spoke to Gareth, says the results were falsified, and noting the results in his diary, in the image, you can see, I think on the right of the screen, Gareth notes the image and he says, "Talk of the Constitution is bunk," which is quite a strong thing to say, perhaps for the time. Sadly, it was during this trip that Gareth was contacted by Lloyd George's office to tell him he was to be made redundant. As always, however, Gareth bounced back and landed a job with PR consultant Ivy Lee and Associates in New York. Whilst in the USA, Gareth managed to gate crash a photograph with President Herbert Hoover and to get involved with domestic politics. One of the assignments at Ivy Lee was a report on the 5-year plans being carried out in the Soviet Union. And Gareth was dispatched along with Jack Hines to the Hines Food Empire to the Soviet Union. This being Gareth's second time to the Soviet Union, he was much better prepared. What Gareth recorded whilst there was not positive at all. In file 35, the first of 3 notebooks from the trip, you can see on the left, he wrote, "The worker is better off from the view of housing conditions, but he gets hardly better clothing. From the point of view of food, he is much worse off. Health programme, on paper it's fine, but in reality the worker often has to wait months for treatment. There are a few hospitals, and they are crowded and dirty." However, during the visit, Gareth managed something of a coup, an interview with Lenin's widow. He recorded his initial impressions of her in the notebook B112, and there's an image from that notebook on the right. He describes Lenin's widow. She had greyish-white hair, brushed closely back, mouth a little twisted, heavy, swollen eyelids, one eye a little bloodshot and purple on the eyelids. Had a smile full of sympathy and love for children, although he says, "She did not wish me to take notes." This interview formed the basis of an article later published in the Western Mail under the title "Lenin's Widow Talks to a Welshman." He talked about how she was with Lenin during his exiles, how she inspired him, and how since Lenin's death she had devoted herself to improving education. Even, however, in an interview in Moscow with a communist leader carried out in Russian, Gareth's background comes to the fore when he describes the way she talks about production. And I quote, "In the same tone the Welsh minister talks about God." There is an interesting insight into the way that the communists wanted to reorganise society as well as part of this interview. Lenin's widow complained that their position had been misinterpreted, and she said they did not want to take children away from their families. The defence she gives to this, she says, "We don't want to take children away from their families because they must learn about life, about factories, and about workers." But she does admit they wanted children to spend their daytime with other children in communal areas and communal care, and the care of trained psychologists rather than their parents. Back in the USA, Gareth lived a pretty good life. He had income from speaking engagements and articles, but the grinding poverty caused by the Great Depression was never far away. In letters to his parents in New York in November 1931, he discusses being paid $1,000 for a speaking engagement, meeting with well-dressed and terrified bank executives, and of finding a hobo city, which he gives a vivid description of in the item on the left of the screen. He says, "Saturday I saw a remarkable sight. I walked from Broad Street, along Wall Street and Broadway a little to get to the road that goes past the quay on the Hudson River. Not many minutes from rich Wall Street, I saw a patch of land covered in bricks and stones where a building had been brought to the ground. Suddenly, I saw what looked like little huts, and then I noticed there were holes dug in the ground, and that Negro unemployed had made dugouts with old cardboard boxes and pieces of wood. They had dug holes in the ground and built walls of cardboard and wood. Some of them were well built. There were about 100 Negroes living there." Back with the better off, Gareth went to Philadelphia and on his return to New York, managed to interview with Al Smith, who he had written about back in his Cambridge days. In his letter of the 17th of April 1932, which you can see on the right of the screen, he says, "Tomorrow morning at 11:30, I shall have an interview in the Empire State Building, 102 stories, over 1,000 feet high, the highest building in the world, with Al Smith, former governor of New York, Democratic presidential candidate in 1928, and one of the outstanding personalities in America." However, his contract with Ivy Lee was coming to an end, and he travelled back to Barry from New York. His niece, Dr. Margaret Cyril Colley, who later presented Gareth's papers to the National Library, was very close to him. And in the weeks leading up to his return, he asks about her health in his correspondence and hoped very much that she'd be able to come to Southampton and meet him. What's wonderful about these letters is that, as well as the detail of the big events, the things that we all know about history, there's all these little things about family life and about Gareth's personal relations, which make it a wonderful resort. Once back in the UK, Gareth again went to work for Lloyd George for a short time before he was travelling in Europe and once again writing for the Western Mail. This trip would see Gareth witness and report on similar issues to those he had previously seen across the continent, but where the situation had severely and rapidly worsened. Gareth was in Leipzig on the day that Adolf Hitler was made Chancellor of Germany, and in a note in file 36 on that day, he writes in capital letters, "Hitler ist Reichskanzler," Hitler is Chancellor. Over the next few days, Gareth travelled to Dresden and Danzig, where he asked about Hitler and his new government, but he wanted to see for himself, so he made his way to Berlin. There are many items in the National Library collections which have amazing stories behind them, and which will give you a small shiver in your spine when you hold them. One of these items is without a doubt an item we call B1/9, which is with typical archival understatement. It is better known as the Hitler Diary, and there's two images from the Hitler Diary on the screen in front of you now. File B19 is an item I've used in a number of talks about using archives to students, many of whom are sometimes a bit disinterested, not really paying attention. But when you read them from folio 21 recto, it totally changes the atmosphere in the room. It sparks all sorts of questions about similar things that they can find in archives to study. Now, the amazing thing about Gareth's archive is this is not unique. There are items in Gareth's archive, quite a few of them, which have the same effect when you hold them in your hand and when you read them. The swastika on the left, it's quite unusual in Gareth's notebooks. There aren't many drawings, so Gareth must have known this was going to be a particularly newsworthy item. The description of the journey and the people aboard the plane drags you in. He writes, "In aeroplane over Berlin, snow. If aeroplane should crash, all history of Germany would change. Hitler a few feet away, Goebbels behind him." In the version published in the Western Mail, Gareth notes that if the aeroplane should crash, the whole history of Europe would change, obviously realising the significance of this story outside just Germany. And this was quite early on. His notes show that he was impressed with the plane, the Richthofen, describing it as the fastest and best aeroplane in Germany and travelling at 240 kilometres per hour. Little details, such as one of the bodyguards eating a boiled egg and Goebbels eating a cheese sandwich, pepper the notes. The guard's black uniform with a skull and crossbones on his cap merits attention, as does Goebbels' smile when he reads a newspaper headline about 50,000 people listening to his speech in Hanover. When Hitler got out of his car to board the plane, Gareth saw him, and I quote, as a very ordinary looking man. He said, "It's a mystery to me how he has his appeal. He looks like a middle-class grocer." On board the plane, Hitler studied a map, and Gareth completes the painting which is given for it in words. He says, "Beneath us now is a sea of clouds, but above, absolutely clear blue sky." After the plane lands in Frankfurt, Gareth watches how the crowd is wound up, with a band playing and chant of Heil Hitler. Every space is taken, and he notes flags flying twice as high as the Eisteddfod Pavilion, a reference which would probably only work in a Welsh newspaper. It's worth comparing Gareth's notes here and the completed Western Mail article. Sadly, some of Gareth's observations didn't make it the final cut, but its sentence noting that Hitler has stirred Germany into an awakening is, with hindsight, very foreboding indeed. Gareth wrote about the experience of flying with Hitler with other news back to his family in Barry. If you look at the image on the left, he says, "My trip to Germany was wonderful. What a coup it was to be invited to fly with Hitler. I thoroughly enjoyed that." Having said that, if I'd been in his shoes, I may not have taken the flight at all. As only a few days earlier, when travelling from Berlin to Berlin in the first place, he'd had an awful experience on the flight, as recorded in the postcard on the right. He says in a previous letter he was looking forward to seeing the Polish corridor and Prussia from the air, but it wasn't to be. The postcard notes that there was a huge storm over the Polish corridor and there was a forced landing in Prussia. Doesn't sound like a trip for the faint-hearted. And as I said about the little things that come out of the archive on occasion that go along with the big news stories, I love the way in which, on the letter on the left, he says to his parents, "Please don't worry, I'm inoculated against typhus in Berlin." There's another letter a few days earlier which mentions that he was going to be visiting the Nazi headquarters and arranged to speak to Hitler's secretary. And this is possibly how he got to go on that plane trip in the first place. For all this talk of the excitement, Gareth was fully aware of what was going on. His notes are full of references to fascism, violence, and dictatorship. When he returned to Germany in 1934, he recorded the deepening terror. In file 42 on the left, he sees the militarization of Germany. He wrote that Germany has become a barracks, although he was struck by the lack of uniforms being worn on the street. During a visit to towns in the Harz region, once again in the office, on the right, I believe this one is, I thought it was on the left, he notes that the number of preachers had been arrested and every greeting was Heil Hitler until you get sick of it. His notes from the 9th of October, these are in the image on the right, are particularly chilling. Tells of a case. "I was told by Milita of a terrible fate of Idris Morgan's friend, Fräulein Sommer, a beautiful blonde girl. She was found dead in the apartment of Bruckner, Hitler's adjutant. The criminal police phoned the parents long after to say your daughter's been found dead. Alles ist erledigt. Everything is done. There was no medical examination done. The criminal police seem to be afraid of Bruckner, who has a lot of power." There are further details that show the investigation was minimal and that no one would take any further. It was a foretaste of the kind of immunity that the fascist leaders had in this new state. In an article that she published in the Western Mail on March the 2nd, 1933, this was only a few days after his flight on Hitler's plane. He was just about to make his visit to the Soviet Union. And he wrote in his Western Mail article, "The Europe of 1933 has seen the birth of the Hitler dictatorship in Germany. What will it see in the Soviet Union?" What he would see would make Gareth world famous. It would sicken him and ultimately cost him his life. Gareth arrived in Moscow on March the 5th, 1933. This is his third and final visit to the Soviet Union, and he was immediately apparent that things were very bad. On the first day, there are notes in his diary about the famine in the villages, comments about eggs becoming luxuries, and those who have fled to Moscow terrified about being forced to return. The three diaries which record Gareth's final visit to the Soviet Union are in the same category as the Hitler diary. They have the power to stop the reader in their tracks. They're detailed, powerful, and terrifying. They're the kind of material that sometimes you think should carry a warning. A bit like Winfried von Thomas's dispatches from Bergen-Belsen. You need to be prepared for what you read. An example is, while still in Moscow, Gareth describing a scene on the street that you can see on the left of the screen. The description is a peasant with 3 children taken away by police, children yelling, shrieking, dragging onto the sheepskin coat of the father, arrested for begging. You really don't want to think where they may have ended up. Another note a few pages later records the case of a 15-year-old girl who said something against Stalin, and she was taken by the GPU and given 10 years imprisonment. By now, the conversations Gareth has had with people who describe the terrible situation in Ukraine. No food, no seeds to plant, animals dying, a legion. Gareth notes a conversation with Elle about the theatre and the lack of freedom of expression in writing. Gareth asks, how would you describe the famine in the villages? Elle replies, well, there is no famine. You must take a longer view. The present hunger is temporary. In writing books, you must have a longer view. It will be difficult to describe hunger. But Gareth has no such difficulties. And in the image on the right, he describes the stark situation seen with his own eyes. And this is one of those phrases which really brings home to you what's going on. He says, in the Ukraine, a little later, I crossed the border from Great Russia into Ukraine. Everywhere I talked to peasants who walked past, they all had the same story. There is no bread. We haven't had bread for over 2 months. A lot of dying. The first village had no more potatoes left, and the stock of beetroot was running out. They all said the cattle dying. There is nothing to feed the cattle with. We used to feed the world, but now we are hungry. How can we sow when we have so few horses left? How will we be able to work in the fields when we are weak from the want of food? And again, if you had come before the revolution, we would have given you chicken and eggs and milk and fine bread. Now we have no bread in the house. They're killing us. As well as the fear of starvation, the fear of the secret police is ever present. There are regular references to arrests and to executions, picked up from official sources and from speaking to people in the villages. Gareth builds a clear picture of the starving, terrified society. You see the image on the left, where he notes, the GPU is getting more powerful. Stalin and the GPU now rule Russia. And the determination to stamp out any opposition and local control also comes to fore in notes such as, at the bottom of the page, it says, a new Ukrainian policy. In the past few weeks, there has been the beginning of the Russification of appointments. Muscovites have been placed in leading positions in Kharkov, and now Russian is to be taught in schools. This may have put loyal people in charge, but was further escalating the shortages, not just of food, but the equipment to produce food. Gareth noted the strengthening of the tractor machine situation. He said it was more political than technical, an unusual euphemism in Gareth's note-taking. And while this was going on, while the authorities were waging what they described as a scientific war against religion, there are many reports of religious oppression, churches being demolished, icons being taken, and one comment by a peasant who said, they tried to take my icons, but I'm a peasant, not a dog. And the regime was also purging its own experts, as Gareth reported, a lack of directors and a lack of responsible people who know their subject. Too many have been imprisoned or shot. An indictment of a society which was totally dysfunctional. In file B116, as noted on the right, a visit to the opera, Gareth made a scathing observation. Plenty of lipstick, but no bread. When Gareth came home from the Soviet Union, he was careful. When Gareth came home, he was careful not to make critical remarks whilst he was there. His letter sent from Kharkov on March the 14th, that's on the left, would give the impression that all was well. He said he was having a splendid time, talking of visiting the opera and travelling on the wonderful train, the Arrow, with its sleeping car to Moscow. Just a few days later, however, when he arrived at Danzig, on March the 27th, he sent a very different take on his trip home to Bari, the image on the right, in which he says, the Russian situation is terrible. Famine almost everywhere and millions dying of starvation. I tramped several days through villages in the Ukraine and there was no bread there. Many children had swollen stomachs, nearly all the horses and cows had died and the people themselves were dying. The terror has increased tremendously and the GPU has almost full control. The stage was set for Gareth to break a huge story. And on March the 29th, his article telling the world of the terrible and unnecessary suffering he had seen in the Soviet Union was published in British and American newspapers. This time, Gareth's reporting his visit to the Soviet Union was high profile. It carried his name and certainly wasn't overlooked by the Soviet authorities. I'll quote a little bit from his article where he said, "I walked through villages and 12 collective farms. Everywhere was the cry, 'There is no bread, we are dying.' This cry came from every part of Russia, from the Volga, Siberia, White Russia, the North Caucasus, and Central Asia. I tramped through the Black Earth region that was once the richest farmland in Russia, and because the correspondents have been forbidden to go there to see for themselves what is happening. In a train, a communist denied to me there was a famine. I flung a crust of bread which I'd been eating on my own supply onto the spittoon. A fellow peasant passenger fished it out and ravenously ate it all. I threw an orange peel in the spittoon, and the peasant again grabbed and devoured it. The communist subsided. I stayed overnight in a village where there used to be 200 oxen, and where there are now 6. The peasants were eating the cattle fodder and only had a month's supply left. They told me that many had already died of hunger. 2 soldiers came to arrest a thief. They warned me against travel by night, as there were too many starving, desperate men. We are waiting for death was my welcome. But see, we still have our cattle fodder. Go farther south, there they have nothing. Many houses are empty of people, already dead, they cried." The Soviet authorities fought back. Journalists in Moscow, including Walter Duranty of the New York Times, were quick to try and undermine Gareth's reports. But they hadn't seen the famine firsthand and were fed information by people close to the regime. Duranty hit back with an item entitled, "Russians hungry but not starving." But Gareth was able to substantiate his claims. His articles were not just based on a few days walking in Ukraine, but on longer-term research, interviews with those who'd escaped, diplomats and other news sources. Gregor Mash explained in Eyewitness to the Holodomor, Gareth understood the motivations of his sources, and as a fluent Russian speaker, could often be seen as a foreigner or from somewhere else in the Soviet Union by people he spoke to. They quite often would have no idea that he was a journalist. After this trip, Gareth was banned from the Soviet Union. He went to work once again for the Western Mail in Cardiff, but there's no way that life as a reporter on the Cardiff Daily was going to be enough for him. He still travelled, made notes, and reported from places probably outside his usual remit. Of all the places Gareth visited, perhaps Ireland is the one least remarked on. The trips he made to the Emerald Isle, however, did produce some fascinating notes on the problems which endure there to this day, some of which fortunately have receded. The diary from Gareth's visit later in 1933, scarcely more than a decade since the Irish Free State had been created and the island partition, is wonderfully detailed and full of colourful and worrying descriptions. The parallels between Ukraine and Ireland, 2 countries ravaged by famine, although in very different circumstances, would probably not have been lost on him. Might be more difficult, as Lloyd George, the man that Gareth had a great respect for, was in many ways responsible for many of the problems that he would witness during his travelling in Ireland. On the first page of the Irish diary, on the left, Gareth notes the prevalence of the sectarian divide in Belfast, with the words Catholic v Protestant. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly for a British journalist, he made quite an effort to look at both sides of the conflict, holding interviews and recording conversations with nationalist and unionist politicians, priests and ministers, workers and farmers. But of course, Gareth was working from a Welsh perspective as well as a British one. The result is a detailed and fairly comprehensive exploration of the feelings of both communities in the relatively young Northern Ireland. The deputy leader of Sinn Féin felt that the unionist government was stoking up the fires of division, talking of the killing of a popular publican, saying, "I take it that what must have been in the mind of the killer was that some Catholic ought to be murdered as a reprisal for the killing of a police constable. Members of the government," this is the government of Northern Ireland, "not absolve themselves for some responsibility for the anti-Catholic feeling that existed in Ulster." And on the right, you see at the top of the page, he talks of murder after murder, reprisal after reprisal. The Unionist Minister for Home Affairs, however, struck a very different tone, placing the blame for the violence completely on the IRA and saying, if members of the IRA are not prepared to obey the laws of the country, then the sooner they leave, the better. As well as noting the comments of political leaders, Gareth also tried to get a sense of how normal people, or community leaders on both sides of the sectarian divide, felt about the situation. He realised on the Unionist side, and I quote, there was a fear of the submergence of Ulster in an independent Ireland. This was not an unreasonable viewpoint. Over the previous decades, Protestants in the northeast of Ireland were generally opposed to Home Rule as they feared they would be a minority in rule from Dublin. The partition of Ireland between the Irish Free State and the 6 counties were an attempt by Lloyd George to square an impossible circle, deliver some form of Home Rule that Ireland had voted and fought for, but also to protect those in and around Belfast who were fearful of Home Rule and were also prepared to fight against it. In many ways, it was an impossible situation by the time Lloyd George got round to it, although it's still a bone of contention almost a century later. The cleric quoted by Gareth in the diary was remarkably prophetic when he said, there can be no peace in Ireland, north or south, and no peace with England until partition be undone. Gareth travelled south of Dublin, so crossing the border on the map drawn by Lloyd George's treaty. He came to a country that was slowly recovering from a terrible civil war, that was in an economic malaise and which had its own divisions between those who supported the Anglo-Irish Treaty, created the Free State, and those who opposed remaining within the British Commonwealth and who still claimed the 6 counties of Ulster administered from Belfast. Gareth arranged an interview with the widow of Kevin O'Higgins, a member of the Dáil and minister in the first government of the Irish Free State. O'Higgins had been murdered by the anti-treaty IRA in 1927. Once again, in this interview, Gareth paints a beautiful picture of Mrs. O'Higgins. A wonderful personality, tall, perfectly featured, dark hair, dark, large, deep eyes, but calm dignity and naturalness about her, gracious, long blue velvet dress which fell in flowing folds, fine delicate features, and thin nose. And he compared her to the other political widow he'd interviewed earlier. He says, Lenin's widow and she are the women who impressed me the most. Before digging into the murky world of Irish politics, O'Higgins' widow praised Michael Collins as a brave and gallant man with a sharp tongue, but who understood realities. He was, however, no fan of the Taoiseach Eamon de Valera, describing him as an egotist and hating superior people. She did feel, however, that de Valera had one quality. You see an image on the left. It says, he is an astute politician, and the most astute thing he ever did was the murder of my husband. He wanted him removed, and now he has bought the house next door to my husband's old house. This is pretty remarkable stuff. Ireland's Civil War politics was murky, but the war had long ended by 1927, and de Valera was leader of the opposition when ordering the hit that she accused him of. But he was, at the time of the interview, the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister. This sounds something more like you'd expect in sort of post-democratic Poland or Germany, with a breakdown of democracy, which had affected those countries by the 1930s, rather than the country which had the only country which has a land border with the United Kingdom. One thing that Ireland did have in common with those countries, and indeed with most countries of the world by this point, was a disastrous economic situation. The Free State had been born with a weak economy and went through a costly civil war before then being hit by the fallout from the Wall Street crash of 1929. It was grim. Gareth noted that emigration had slowed. Irishmen were returning home from the USA and Canada with the thought they might as well starve at home as anywhere else. Farmers couldn't pay rates and were trembling. De Valera was unable to see the consequences of his actions and was likely to declare Ireland a republic. Some of the consequences of which were more obvious than others. Obviously, there would be some constitutional change. Britain might double down on the trade war. But there was also the likelihood that many Irish citizens living and working in the UK would be adversely affected. Gareth notes, if the Irish Free State became a republic, the Irish in Liverpool would be deported. Disaster if about 1 million of them descended on de Valera. Glasgow and Liverpool would be delighted to get rid of the Irish. Now, whether the idea of declaring a republic was to distract from the economic woes or cause a rise of the flag effect, Gareth noted that unlike in many other countries, communism was not really a threat and had not been able to gain a foothold in Ireland due to the strength of the Catholic Church. But the forces of fascism certainly had. A force that not many people associate with the Irish Free State in the 1930s. The forces were led, somewhat surprisingly, by a former Garda commissioner, Ian O'Duffy. O'Duffy led an organisation known as the Blue Shirts, and during the Second World War was under surveillance by the Irish Secret Services. Gareth made efforts to find out what was driving people to the Blue Shirts and how much influence they had. He recorded a popular song in his diary, which goes, "I'll have a blue shirt, a blue shirt, a taboo shirt, an anti-ballyhoo shirt. It's just the thing for me. He also noted the graffiti he saw, which directed a great deal of anger towards England. You can see on the right graffiti saying, "Damn your concessions to England, no surrender, up the Republic, boycott British goods." Gareth had gone to Ireland to try and find out if it indeed was headed towards another civil war, or was rapidly developing into an attractive Celtic homeland. I think he felt left feeling that while the truth was somewhere between, Ireland was suffering a terrible economic time and democracy there, as elsewhere, was very fragile. Now, craving adventure once more, Gareth set off on a round-the-world trip in October 1934. As he left for Germany, he recorded in his diary, "I'm a free man. I belong to no organisation, at the whim of nobody but myself. I've about £1,000. I made my will on Friday, and now I'm off to Germany." On the train to London, he struck up a conversation with Lady Rhondda. And while in London, he met with Ernest Jack, who told him that the industrialist and international peace campaigner Lord Davis of Llandinam was going to meet Hitler on his next visit to Germany. Conversely, this is one of the things about being an archivist, you do come across these connections. Davis's archive, which is also the National Library of Wales, contains papers mentioning Jack and explaining and expressing some substantial concerns about his motives, as well as the Nazi infiltration into the new Commonwealth Society's Berlin office. From Davis's point of view, it didn't sound like he was going to meet Hitler at all. The Round the World tour is recorded in a series of 11 diaries, calling in the USA, Japan, the Philippines, Singapore, Cambodia, and China. I'm going to skip a lot of this, but I'll just go to Japan straight away, where Gareth talked about how clean and modern the place is. I think I need to go to the next slide. No, he talks about clean and modern the place is. He mentions that his hotel could be anywhere in Europe, it's modern. He also mentions that while his letters will be sent via Siberia, they won't be opened and checked in the Soviet Union. Once again, Gareth noting his concerns about what could be said and what couldn't be said by anything that could be seen by the Soviet authorities. Now, it's important to note that Gareth was a man of his time. He used language and said things that perhaps today we might find a little uncomfortable, e.g. commenting on the cleanliness of people in Asia. But going through the archive, I don't get the impression Gareth held the kind of views that were common at the time in this regard. He seems, he was well travelled, and his writings, to me anyway, show respect for the cultures which he experienced. But you have to remember, of course, he was writing for an audience of almost 100 years ago, brought up on empire and the idea of the superiority of the European or English-speaking world. Perhaps to us, we'd be surprised that a journalist would even mention such a thing as how clean the people are. But Gareth would have needed to write this for his audience, and that would involve tackling any stereotypes they may have had in order to present the picture as he saw it. The other thing to consider is it's easy with hindsight to concentrate on what Gareth got right in his writing. He seems to have got the measure on the dangers of fascism, and he certainly pulled out the communist system in the Soviet Union as corrupt, inept, and cruel. He did read some people a little bit wrong. He wasn't impressed with Franklin Roosevelt, describing him as a dictator, and seeing parallels with the way that he was managing the US economy, and seeing parallels there with Hitler's reforms in Germany. In Japan, he records an interview with Yosuke Matsuoka, the foreign minister during the early part of the Second World War, where he observes that nobody dreams there'll be a war here, out of the question for a long time, if ever. It was also in Japan that, unbeknown to him, Gareth stayed with the contact of the Soviet Secret Service, who was able to provide information to them on Gareth's plans while he visited China. Now, while it had been several years since Gareth's expose of the Holodomor, during his round-the-world trip, some of those articles had been republished, stirring up the controversy once again, and putting Gareth back on the radar of the Soviet authorities. Gareth travelled on from Japan to China, sending back numerous letters with colourful descriptions and taking photographs recording life as he saw it. Included just a few here because they were among the material that we've recently digitised, and they give such a wonderful image of the trip and wonderfully complement the extensive notes that Gareth took in his diaries. However, travel was very difficult, and the facilities were not as comfortable as in Japan. In the letter on the left, you see he talks about staying in a horrible Chinese inn. In other letters, he talks about having to wait for roads to dry out. You can see the result of it on the image on the right. where his card hadn't been pulled out. And in a letter sent on the 24th of July 1935, with a typed extract, it's in the top right, it's quite poignant, where he says, "I left home exactly 9 months ago today, and I shall be returning home in something over 3 months." But he never made it. After being detained by Japanese soldiers, he was sent on his way on a supposedly safe route through Bandit Country, where he was kidnapped and held for 16 days before being murdered on the eve of his 30th birthday. While in captivity, the Western Mail republished a series of his articles and provided daily updates on Garrett's situation. And after his death, the paper cooperated with an initiative to raise money for a scholarship in his memory, which is still in operation today. In the non-digitised part of the collection, there is a file of correspondence with officials at the Foreign Office where the family try and find out what happened. Couched in diplomatic speak, it's a clear message that the British government strongly suspected the Soviet authorities were involved in Garrett's death. The end of the story of the archive didn't end there, of course. After Garrett's death, his parents kept things, and there they stayed until 1990, when Garrett's sister, Gwyneth Vaughan-Jones, moved to live with other family members in Nottingham. Garrett's niece, Dr. Margaret Tyrrell Colley, person he'd asked about in his letters from New York, realised the importance of the papers. She studied them and published Garrett's biography, More Than a Grain of Truth, and that's recently been revised and republished, and I'd recommend anyone with interest in Garrett's life and work to go for that book. She then kindly transferred the original diaries, letters and photographs to the care of the National Library of Wales, so that they could be accessed by historians, researchers and journalists. The role of Garrett's family didn't end there either. Cyril's son, the late Nigel Colley, created a website, and the family's been active in promoting Garrett's work at every opportunity. When I'm talking to students about the archives and show some of Garrett's papers, I've often had the comment, someone should make a film about this. And of course now they have. And once again, that is worth watching. But there is still much of the story to tell. The staff of the National Library have done a wonderful job in digitising the archive, and it wouldn't have been possible without the financial support from the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Foundation, the Ukrainian National Women's League of America, and the Temerity Family Foundation report commissioned from Garrett's family. We're incredibly grateful to them all for making this possible. Just to finish, I will say that I did think about calling this talk Gareth Jones, the Man Who Knew Too Much. But while the background to his death is an important element of the story, it shouldn't be the defining one. His career may have been short, but it was action-packed, and it provided valuable insight into a world at a key moment to leaders such as Lloyd George, who influenced such as Ivy Lee, and to the wider public. I often think what would have happened had he lived to contribute and report on the Second World War. Through the wonderful collection of archives he left, provides a valuable record of the man who travelled in the turbulent world of the 1930s, who met Hitler, exposed Stalin. It's an essential reading, not just for historians, but also for journalists and the wider public. It's a truly remarkable collection, and now much of it is available free to the world. I'm sure Gareth would have been delighted.